Over to you, Sango.
Is the meeting recording now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 6th plenary session of the Spark-supported conference on globalization and new terrains of consciousness, phenomenologies of the global, local, and glocal. This session will see Dr. Suman Gupta talk to us about data determinism and pre-conceptual historiography. The chair of this session would be Professor Mohammad Asaduddin. Professor Asaduddin, who is an author, critic, and translator in several languages, writes on literature, language, politics, and translation studies. He is currently Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Languages, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and advisor to the Vice Chancellor. He has published many books, including film fiction, Tagore, Premchand, and Ray, and the complete translations of Premchand stories in 4 volumes, which was published in 2017. I now invite Professor Asaduddin to begin this plenary session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sango, for your kind words. I would like to begin by paying a huge compliment to Sumi and her team for this veritable feast of academic and intellectual excellence for the last 3 days. I have plugged in as frequently as I could, and each time I joined in, I found the conversation very stimulating and impressive. So congratulations to me once again, and to your whole team. I know it is teamwork. I'm very delighted and excited to introduce Professor Suman Gupta, because I can't use the cliche that he needs no introduction. Why? Because I have introduced him several times in the last couple of years, and between one introduction and the other, there are always books to talk about. So there is always fresh conversations to be acquainted with. He is a familiar face in Jamia. He has delivered talks here, conducted workshops. In fact, the one I remember and I was a part of, along with other colleagues from the other 2 central universities, was the one about English studies, which culminated in London, and again, colleagues from Delhi University and JNU, all of us who are there. And the findings of that workshop, which culminated in a series of earlier workshops, I find are still very relevant. The audience would be interested to know that we have now begun a new series of conversations on the trajectory of English studies in South Asia under the edges of YACLALS, in which Professor Gupta is a permanent interlocutor. He is Professor of Literature and Cultural Studies at the Open University, UK. He has a long, impressive list of books. For consideration of time, I won't go through all of them. I'll just name a couple. To begin with, Globalization and Literature, Contemporary Literature, The Basics, 2012, which I read with much interest, which is a smart guide to literature students. A quirky book that should have been taken more notice of, I think, not because I have reviewed it, is Consumable Text in Contemporary India, Uncultured Books and Bibliographical Sociology, which is an interesting study of what goes by the name of pulp literature and popular literature. Then Reconsidering English Studies in Indian Higher Education, that is what I primarily relate him to. In fact, he is my go-to person if I want to know anything about the global direction of English studies in different countries, which, as I have said, is a part of our new series of conversations. And the last book I will name, in fact, there are 9 authors, I think, he's one of them. Social Analysis and the COVID-19 Crisis, a collective journal. Who better than him would know the ramifications of the crisis, because he was himself marooned in Delhi, away from his intimate family for almost the whole duration of the pandemic, when his university tried to rescue him several times, and each time the flights got cancelled. Finally, when he landed in London, perhaps he faced the strictest lockdown because of the new strain of the coronavirus. So I think he is both an observer and a victim of the pandemic, and his opinions in this regard will be relevant. He's going to talk on the topic data determinism and pre-conceptual historiography. I'll read from the abstract just to give you the train of his thoughts. This presentation argues that the effect of inclusive historical accounts depends not merely on academic historiographical principles, but on having audiences which are habituated to a sort of common sense of history. This common sense of history is grounded in notion of intentionality, which bear upon broader notions of historical agency and causality. Common sense, always within quotes, in this instance is understood as a pre-conceptual, but not therefore lacking in consistency and practical principles. So it is meaningful to propose a pre-conceptual historiography. As we know, historiography, history writing in general, and literary historiography is a very live subject in India. We know what about our contemporary situation when every regime, incoming regime, wants to change first the history books. So it will be interesting to know Professor Suman Gupta's current thoughts on this. I'm also wondering whether he would take a small detour, if time permits, to talk about literary historiography, because at least 2 contributors to this conference that I know of, Nishat Zaidi and Shougata Badari, are engaged in writing critical histories in 2 Indian literatures, Urdu and Bangla, in a series that might extend to 24 volumes. As one of the general editors of this series, I see every day intriguing parallels and divergences among different literary cultures in India, and I am constantly looking for clues to make sense of them. I'm sure I'll get some clues today. Over to Professor Suman Gupta.
Thank you, Asad, for that very generous introduction. And I'm very grateful indeed to the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I hope you can hear me. I'm always in doubt in these things because it's so quiet out there. I can barely hear you breathe. I can just about see you nod. So yeah, so thanks for the introduction. And I fear that I wouldn't be throwing any light on anything. I'll just be trying to throw some cloud and fog and make things more complicated. So I'll push on with this. So my paper is less an argument than a couple of tentative hypotheses. And it's in 2 parts. In the first, I gradually dig my way down to a rather narrow sense of history. And this narrow sense, which is of little interest to historians, I hope connects with the theme of the conference. In the second, I ponder the future prospects for that particular sense of history, and therefore for the scholarly pursuit of history. And in history, in this instance, is the broadest enterprise. It's not political history. It is every form of history, which includes cultural and indeed literary history. So I'll present these two parts as a move from a pre-conceptual historiography towards a pre-conceptual anti-historiography. To start off the first part, historians in various contexts have made concerted efforts, collective efforts, especially in the 1960s and through to the 1990s, to imbue the unnoted in history with noticeable historical significance. The ordinary individual or the neglected population, the everyday event or activity, the unremarkable or ignored space. Those who joined such collective efforts both considered their historiographical principles and historicized their own endeavors, as for instance in History from Below or the History Workshop, which started off in Britain, the Dar es Salaam School of History, microhistory mainly associated with Ginsberg, Alltagsgeschichte, which Lütke had theorized very substantially, and subaltern history, we know that well, the Subaltern History Collective. Despite differences in focus and ideological emphasis, these historiographical approaches and schools present some overlapping features. First, they extended the scope of historical agency where it had earlier been muted, if not denied in doing history. These approaches sought to recognize the intentions and actions of unnoted people and groups by actually doing history and placing them within the evidence narrative, thereby reconstituting history itself. Human intentions and actions in the broadest, smallest, and most inclusive scales were at the heart of these projects to enrich and complicate long-standing notions of historical agency and causality. Second, historiography is nevertheless up to historians ultimately. So these projects were dogged by suspicions that they ultimately express historians' agency more cogently than that of the unnoted. After all, historians set the objective, found the neglected traces and sources, wove the narratives accordingly, mainly in conversation with each other. Emphatic though they were about acknowledging the unnoted, their own agency was more clearly confirmed in the process. With reference to the Subaltern History Collective, Gayatri Spivak, and this is well known, made the influential argument that the deliberate elision of the subjectivity of the historian in their research corresponded to a contradictory muting of the subaltern subjectivity while ostensibly foregrounding it. Implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that sort of argument, that sort of criticism has been leveled at all those collective efforts I mentioned. Third, consequently, to invigorate the agency of the unnoted through cultivating history, if not in actually doing history, these projects attempted to reach outside academia and to engage with wider lay, common, non-academic constituencies that involved setting up workshops, initiating conversations in public spaces and the media, writing for popular outlets, investing in school and general education. These are some of the means that were employed. The idea was that history may only be done in historians' terms, but at least the erstwhile to take possession of his gift. Nevertheless, historians who were most determined to delve the muted corners of history could not but find a one-way street. Historians necessarily do history for passive reception, akin to an intellectual clerisy addressing the laity, whereby the erstwhile unnoted, the ordinary people, or more inclusive, the public, are informed and, so to speak, activated as participants of history. The turn outwards from academic life took a life of its own under the banner of public history. And I put that with a capital P and a capital H, referring to the professional aspect of doing and mediating history. As one of its early proponents, I mean Robert Kelly, put it, and I quote, "The historian answers questions posed by others outside academia. He or she serves as a consultant, a professional, a member of the staff," close quotes. As such, public history was less ideologically driven than the collective efforts I just mentioned, and more in sync with existing corporate and public institutions. It worked to update and consolidate existing establishment rather than to constitute new critical formations. Instead of the erstwhile unnoted, it was the policymakers, the bureaucrats, and the executives of established institutions and their audiences, communities, I put these all in quotation marks, publics, clients, consumers, and markets who were quoted. Public history also came with a reflexive drive to bolster academic institutional interests with employment-targeted teaching programs and practice-based research. There's been some surveys of this. With some critical edge, scholarly analyses of the institutional ideologies, means, products, and transactional practices of various public and popular histories have also appeared. D. Groot, for instance, has written substantially on this. In brief, then, those collective efforts which I mentioned have sought to take account of the muted in history and to take history to the general public, but they have stuck to a top-down direction. Ultimately, agency-rich historians and professionals lend support to passive recipients to help them realize their intentions and actions. And yet, having said that fairly feelingly, that is a rather cynical way of presenting these collective efforts, surely. Such history projects have underpinned claims of and calls for self-possession, self-determination, sovereignty, fulfillment, etc., from various constituencies with more or less justification. But that is probably not just because historians reached out to a passive and inert recipient, bringing it to life. Much more likely, these collective efforts were met halfway by recipients themselves in terms of a habitual, not quite articulated, or a pre-conceptual and pre-existing sense of history. In fact, professional efforts may well have been effective, more effective, if academic historians paid some attention to that lay sense of history. I suggest that this lay sense of history is grounded in a pre-conceptual historiography, which exists already amongst those who receive history, who receive the historian's well-articulated, rigorous narratives based on principled historiography. By the term pre-conceptual, I have in mind the use of the term by Eugene Gendlin in a 60s book on experience, By pre-conceptual historiography, I mean something like the common sense of history, but with an eye on the likelihood that common sense is not random, but underpinned by certain pragmatic organizing principles. And in that sense, the idea of common sense has had considerable philosophical application. I could quote a long list of sources there. So with proper circumspection, let me pose my first hypothesis. What historians do works insofar as it is received by those who are habituated to living and thinking as if they're amidst history. That is, amidst processes where intentions and actions matter, irrespective of how vaguely or inadequately they conceptualize history. The everyday life of the recipients, their unremarkable and narrowly focused intentions and actions, may not seem to have a discernible place in academic history, but nevertheless, those histories are conducted as if, that common sense of history is conducted as if they might, or at least as if they cohere in a minuscule way with a larger dynamic in history. They live as if their little agencies might have some unreckoned but reckonable relation to the big agencies in the general historical unfolding, which is continuously unpacked and repacked. The minutiae of intentions and actions have in this pre-conceptual historiography a continuous relationship with the big intentions and actions that are, so to speak, historical. The preconceived historiography makes it possible to apprehend various precepts of historical causality and agency. So while that sounds plausible in theory, the historian in me feels a bit skeptical. Where's the evidence that there is such a preconceptual historiography, that it actually exists? How can it be characterized and disposed for the historian's contemplation? Would conceptualizing it not immediately undermine it, the preconceptual itself? Investigating whether such a preconceptual historiography can be pinned down is a larger task of the future, I think. I propose the hypothesis, but I don't go very far with trying to prove it. However, it does behoove me to consider potential ways of investigating it. A starting point might be to examine idiomatic phrases or catchphrases in ordinary language usage, suggesting an implicit concept of history in everyday life. In English, these would include phrases like annals of history, the historical record, making history, go down in history, lessons of history, learning from history, doing history, which I'm using myself, being on the right or wrong side of history, that history will show or judge, the tide of history, the historical event. Such phrases offer implicit notions of teleology, causality, utility, and form. Such phrases can be examined to some degree usage can be discerned, might clarify and historicize the preconceptual historiography. You might wonder, for instance, why between 1979 and 2019, the phrases the right or wrong side of history has actually increased tenfold in frequency of usage. What does that suggest? It's a question, and it might tell us something about that common sense of history. So that's my first hypothesis. And since I'm quite keen on some discussion, I'll skip some bits here and move on to my next hypothesis. So I can imagine when I say all that, and when I suggest particularly that ordinary language corpus analysis might clarify a preconceptual historiography with some actual bearing on doing history. When I say this, my colleagues would raise quizzical eyebrows. For them, my historian colleagues, such a suggestion puts me in a camp of revisionist digital history or cliometrics, a particular branch of numerate quantitative historiography. And I'm fairly enthusiastic about that camp, but I doubt that that camp itself would allow me membership. However, that is not quite the direction I want to stray towards. Advocates and practitioners of digital history do not seem to make inroads into preconceptual historiography either, at least not much beyond the level of non-academic audiences for public history. Even if recipients of history are heard, it remains the case that the audiences, communities, readers, markets, consumers, clients, the public may only pose questions of professional historians. I have offered, therefore, the hypothesis of preconceptual historiography not to extol the virtues of digital tools, but to lead towards a contrary hypothesis. To state it succinctly, let me coin the term anti-historiography, by which I mean subscription to any set of principles which disables the consistent application of notions of agency and causality in accounting for the past. Given that, the hypothesis I want to offer now goes as follows. If a preconceptual anti-historiography becomes grounded in habitual living and thinking, becomes the common sense, whereby it is always held that happening rather than action and inevitability rather than intentionality prevail, then doing history will become ineffective. That is to say, inasmuch as recipients of history live and think as if they would not intend and cannot act, except in terms of chronicles foretold, all they can meaningfully receive is not history any longer from historians, but foregone conclusions from authority-bearing pronouncers. It is possible that such a preconceptual anti-historiography cannot be totalized. Perhaps it is too counterintuitive a position for this or any historical juncture. But if such a position did have enough a priori credence in habitual life and thought, so as to shoulder preconceptual historiography, doing history would become less effective. History would start slipping in degrees, becoming extirpated from significant areas of social life and confronted by a certain deafness. This hypothesis, I admit, is stated in excessively abstract terms, yet it might be amenable to testing also. At any rate, the resources of a preconceptual anti-historiography are familiar in restricted domains. In exploring them, let's begin with the most fundamental assumptions. To be clear, what I dub a preconceptual anti-historiography is distinct from philosophical investigations into concepts of free will, fatalism, determinism, providence, on which there is a great deal of work. While these concepts, the philosophical concepts, aim at conceptual analysis, the kind of preconceptual anti-historiography I have in mind is preconceptual. It is habitually lived and taught rather than argued. Some notion of the former may, however, be obtained, this preconceptual history, by looking at surveys of lay attitudes, of what people think. And there are several of these, there are quantifications. So you can survey, for example, people's ordinary language views on what is free will and what is determinism. And there are several such rigorously conceived attitudes. Nevertheless, between rigorously considered concepts and surveys of lay attitudes, one can find some obvious constituents of anti-historiography being thrown forth, and two, which are often mentioned, which seem to often come to the foreground, is religious fatalism or revelation or providence, it's all predetermined, and increasingly, scientific determinism bearing upon social causality, such as biogenetic or evolutionary determinism. Such resources of anti-historiography have considerable histories themselves, and they have obviously not managed to significantly undermine the status of doing history yet. They haven't. They have not quite overshadowed the pre-conceptual historiography which is necessary for history to be received seriously. We may surmise that recipients of history have found ways to keep their pre-conceptual historiography active in their habitual lives and thoughts, while making tractable spaces for the accommodation of anti-historiographical concepts, perhaps putting the anti-historiographical concepts in the stratosphere of the Geist at some distance from the materiality of the everyday. However, it is widely considered now that a sort of technological or perhaps technocratic determinism on the back of large and linked data sets and algorithmic applications have penetrated into habitual social life to an unprecedented degree. The penetration appears to be top-down. It's structured through governance systems, themselves seemingly shorn of human agency, and they bear upon all. These include surveillance mechanisms premised more on how populations and individuals behave despite themselves rather than in acting intentionally. They also include ahistorical modes of economic engineering and financial management, which have been extensively investigated, mostly with growing unease. The technocratic functionaries producing and regulating these systems focus on anti-historiographical resources at the expense of historiographical principles. Genetic dispositions and evolutionary rationales play an indispensable part in that technocratic engineering. The penetration also appears within the minutiae of life on the ground. The extent to which networked apps inform and enable daily action at home, at work, or at leisure may well be reconfiguring how individuals regard themselves and others and constitute each other as data selves or data profiles. Arguably, intentionality and automaticity, motive and impulse, act and reflex, calculation and design are becoming gradually indistinguishable in everyday life amidst the pervasive technoscape. And this is an appropriate forum to evidence this technoscape in action that surrounds us all. I have put these observations impressionistically. They do not really need elaboration if they seem at all familiar. If you have thought this already, my point is made. Irrespective of the extent to which this condition is empirically grounded, it is possible that habitual living and thinking is coming to be conducted with conviction in the pre-conceptual anti-historiography of data determinism. possibly many are now leading their lives and thinking as if happening supersedes action, because intentions are actually chimerical. They are doing so and are constantly exhorted to do so because it is convenient and often compulsory in the prevailing technoscape and the technocratic power structure that we are constituted within. If the hypothesis stated above holds, a challenge to doing history meaningfully is probably already afoot and certainly imminent, calling for a collective conceptual and practical effort from historians in every discipline of the humanities. Wherever we are, historians doesn't mean a department. From this perspective, historians are everyone in any aspect of humanities. That effort would not involve contributing to the ever burgeoning and largely celebratory study of how digital capacities aid history. While that is indeed an exciting field, circumspection does not go amiss in this respect. The logic of data analysis and historical analysis work in a tension that is productive and unproductive at the same time. What I have in mind is a different and somewhat more probing investigation of the relationship between history in the 21st century and data determinism. It seems to me that John Gaddis, who wrote an excellent book in 2002 on the theory of history, his arguments usefully articulate some predicates for such an investigation. Particularly suggestive is his positioning of the historian's methods apropos of social sciences and what he calls the natural sciences. Gaddis actually argues that the kind of contingent and retrospective explanations of social junctures based on available evidence and plausible narrative that constitute history are actually closer to the natural or hard sciences and incommensurate with social science, which he regards as an older form of rationalization. In this framework, data determinism would be more in the area of the social science than the hard science, because the hard science makes place for uncertainty and randomness, increasingly so. I think it's a useful idea. There are plenty of metaphors at work there, but that's just a hint. The point I did wish to make is that the collective enterprise of doing history from wherever we are needs to think its position, its unspoken assumption of causality and intentionality by considering the world that is beginning to emerge under technocracy. Thanks for listening to that, and I hope there'll be some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Suman Gupta. Participants, please kindly post questions in the chat box right here. In the meantime, may I invite Professor Asaduddin to briefly comment on Professor Gupta's.
Thank you, Professor Gupta, for a very stimulating talk. By the very nature of it, I understand that it is the beginning of a conversation, and the arguments will be further developed as the ideas will be refined and carried on. Particularly, I find your first hypothesis very interesting, because we would not have examined, normally we do not examine these phrases and idioms in the context of larger history that we are part of or we are in the process of making. So I find that your talk has sufficient food for thought, and because of the paucity of time, perhaps we can carry that conversation on the chat boxes as other presenters here have been doing. And I suppose Professor Gupta will be pleased to answer those questions. And at a later stage, perhaps if we are sufficiently provoked and interested, we can have a more developed and more relaxed conversation, not in the format of a very tight schedule, but in a somewhat more informal gathering or informal environment. So thank you very much, and I thank all the members of the audience and the brilliant organizers who have been organizing it. Thank you very much.
Zara, Shraddha, will you take over? Yeah, because I think...
and you're all frozen on my screen.
Something.
It's okay, Professor Gupta, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear. Yeah. Yes, and normally what I do at this point is ask everyone else questions. Because I have quite a lot of questions. But do feel free to write to me even at my email address if you do have any further thoughts on that. Thanks.
Professor Bhaduri, did you want
Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Yes. Yeah, I was frantically trying to type that. Could I please ask a verbal question? And there is no typed question. So really time is not really really of concern here. So I was wondering, Suman, that maybe currently the way history itself has become a contested terrain and there are contesting histories. I mean, history has become really the battlefront currently in our own society and elsewhere, with fascistic attempts to reappropriate history and conversely other attempts to hold on to a particular kind of historiography. I was wondering, I have a few questions. If I appear a bit muddled, that's precisely the point. I'm sure that you'd be able to, the objective is to have a discussion rather than me having a pointed question, so to say. So I was wondering if the classic distinction between the professional historiographer and people's history, or a people's historical project that could take the form of anti-historiography or a counter-memorial practice, whether that distinction will have to be suitably, or the goalpost has to be suitably shifted in our current times of data determinism, which was probably the direction that he wanted to take us to, because pre-conceptual historiography and pre-conceptual anti-historiographies in the days of data determinism, while might on the one hand definitely take us to preconceived histories, pre-conceptual historiography being itself the foundation of preconceived histories, histories that commonsensically would be thought of to be true, and thereafter circulated through data deterministic sets, through the social media, as you rightly pointed out, and internalized by a significant set of the population and become a counter-memorial, an anti-historical practice, but nevertheless something that normativity would like to prop up. So preconceived histories or preconceived commonsensical histories, which might as well as emerge from preconceptual historiographies of data determinism, versus just a, let's say, stiff upper lip, very academese, official, professional historiography, may not necessarily be the terrain where the battle is to be fought anymore. I guess you were also precisely taking us towards that maybe people's histories, but of alternate modes, and maybe appropriating data sets to a certain extent, because it's not that the alternate historiographies which will run against both official stiff upper lip historiographies, academic professional historiographies, as well as some of those preconceived normativity propped commonsensical historiographies, maybe even the third way of hanging on to a radical people's historiography will also have to maybe take recourse to a bit of the data sets. I don't know, I was just kind of thinking aloud and responding to your talk rather than asking a question, but if this could promote a discussion, and considering particularly that there weren't any pointed questions, so I thought that I would just kind of pitch in.
Yeah, thanks, Sugar. As you say, there's much there and very relevant points, which I think we do need to pick up afterwards if I can see the time right. But just to quickly say that indeed, I think that, as Asad was saying, the beginning of the discussion, I hope, rather than sort of drawing a line under anything. Data sets are used extensively in history. I think the question is the spirit in which they're used. And it does seem that they're often used as if there is a kind of automaticity. And I mentioned cliometrics. Cliometrics is basically economic history, which uses large data sets of different periods to mark trends and match them onto historical eventuality or facts. When one does that, it seems as if history becomes a kind of automatic or spontaneous project, rather than a matter for policies and strategies and intentions. And I think that there's a little danger there. It's a conceptual danger, but turning history into a mechanical unfolding rather than a human attempt, however conservative or however radical. I think it's more dangerous to think of history as an automatic unfolding than to think of history even conservatively as something that people do. So I think that's a more fundamental problem for us to look at. And as far as you mentioned the current fascistic kind of histories that are being pushed from above in India as indeed elsewhere, not least in Europe, all over. A great deal of that is actually being pushed through data determinism. That is the management of the public, even giving history as something that is kind of spoon-fed through the public according to audience reactions and inclinations, is a mode of dehistoricizing history as we speak. So I think that is something that needs to be brought more into the foreground than I think it currently is. I think we rather feel that history is being offered from a different ideological point of view, which is true, but it is underpinned by something else. It's also actually not history at all. It is an anti-history in narrative, which is meant to dominate and suppress any live reaction. And that, I think, is the nature of, I wouldn't even call it fascist history. I think it is fascist anti-history. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Suman Gupta, for your time for this engrossing lecture. I really wish we could continue this discussion, but unfortunately, we do not have the time. But hopefully, we'll be able to continue this discussion on this conversation on other platforms or perhaps through email. Thank you on behalf of all the participants and the committee here for spending your time and sharing your thoughts with us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Asaduddin for being here and sharing this session. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you all the participants. We have the next session